imperial letter, race, cross-dressing, and the cult of domesticity. Wife and servant are the same, but only differ in the name. Lady Chudley. The wife became the head servant. Friedrich Engels. In May 1854, at the age of 25, Arthur Munby stopped a maid of all work in the street Fig 3.1. The encounter was as casual as any of the hundreds that filled Munby's wanderings, yet the woman was destined to become his lifelong companion and wife. Almost immediately, Hannah Colwick and Arthur Munby embarked on an intense but clandestine love affair that lasted the rest of their lives. After 19 years, they married. Secretly, though they lived in the same house for only 4 years and then, to all appearances, only as master and housemaid. Colwick and Munby both record in their diaries that they instantly felt destined for each other. In a sense, it was no accident that the maid of all work and the barrister met in the street. In the promiscuous crowd, that element permanently on the verge of social confusion, classes mingle, strangers brush each other, women and men rub shoulders and part. As Benjamin writes, a street, a conflagration, or a traffic accident assemble people who are not defined along class lines. Colwick and Munby took sustenance from the crowd, pitching their strange fantasy life on the borders of social limits, gender and race, paid and unpaid work, domesticity, and empire. Their sense of destiny, moreover, bore witness to the social force of the Victorian edicts they so scandalously flouted in private and so decorously affirmed in public. At the same time, the chance encounter, the forbidden meeting across social limits, reveals itself as a recurrent theme in the domestic and racial fetishism that structured their lives, indeed, that structured Victorian society at large. Leonore Davidoff has vividly evoked the games and fetish rituals Colwick and Munby staged for their mutual pleasure when together and relived in their diaries when apart. Munby later excised from his diaries the details of the training he claims he gave Colwick, but we know she chose to address him by the imperial title Massa, and that she wore a slave band on her wrist and a lock chain around her neck, to which only Munby had the key, as proof of her bondage. Figs 3.2 to 3.4. We know that she would kneel, lick his boots and wash his feet to profess her love and servitude. She posed for numerous photographs, as her working self in her dirt, cross, dressed as an upper-class lady, as a rural maiden, a man, an angel, a male slave, and almost nude and blackened from head to foot as a male chimney sweep. Figs 3.5 to 3.11. When they married secretly after 19 years, she cross-dressed as an upper-middle-class lady and traveled with Munby around Europe. Back in London, she would arrange to theatrically scrub the front doorsteps on her knees as Munby sauntered down the street, languidly swinging his cane. Fig 3.12. He checked in at a boarding house where she worked, to be served by her as if they were strangers, then to meet her on the cliff-tops nearby, kissing and giggling and savoring in secret the knowledge of their forbidden liaison. When they lived within reach of each other, Colwick visited Munby frequently in her dirt after a grueling day's work, her clothes dank and filthy, her face deliberately blackened with boot polish, her hands red and raw, only to pose later that same evening freshly dressed as an upper-class lady in clean finery. They spent happy hours mulling over the ordeals of her workload, ritualistically counting and recounting the incredible number of boots she cleaned. On a couple of occasions at her other employer's house, Colwick stripped naked except for a blindfold and climbed into the chimney, where she curled in the warm soot like a dog, savoring the sensation later in her diary for Munby's delectation. Her diary reveals, as his does not, that she also lifted him in her huge, brawny arms, cradled him on her ample lap, and nursed him like a child. Over the years, Colwick wrote a voluminous diary, first at Munby's behest, later for more complex reasons of her own, in which she recounted the daily regimen of her domestic work and her curious life with Munby. Both of their diaries reveal, though differently, a profound and mutual involvement in a variety of fetish rituals, slave/master, S/M, bondage/discipline, B/D, hand, foot, and boot fetishisms, washing rituals, infantilism, or babyism, cross-dressing, and a deep and mutual fascination with dirt. Fundamentally, the scripts for their fantasy life involved theatrically transgressing the Victorian iconographies of domesticity and race, and their fetish rituals took shape around the crucial but concealed affinity between women's work and empire. In what follows, I will argue that their fetishism inhabited the borders of a double disavowal by dominant Victorian society, denial of the value of women's domestic work in the industrial metropolis, and the devaluing of colonized labor in the cultures coming under violent imperial rule. What is the meaning of Colwick and Munby's rituals, belonging as they do in the realm of the fetish? What, in particular, is the relation between fetishism, domesticity, and empire? The Freudian definition of the fetish gives privileged normality to male heterosexuality and the scene of castration. Instead, I wish to explore fetishism as a more complex, historically diverse phenomenon that cannot be reduced to a single, male, sexual narrative of origins. I wish to challenge the primacy of the phallus in the realm of fetishism and open the Freudian and Lacanian theories of fetishism to a more varied and complex history in which class and race play as formative a role as gender. The presiding contradiction animating Colwick and Munby's fetishism is, suggest, the historical dichotomy between women's paid work and women's unpaid work in the home, overdetermined by the contradictions of imperial racism and negotiated by the fetishistic iconographies of slave and master, dirt, and cleanliness, rituals of recognition and cross-dressing. In contrast to the idea of fetishism as a quintessentially male preserve, Colwick takes her place among the countless women for whom fetishism was an attempt, ambiguous, contradictory, and not always successful, to negotiate the boundaries of power in ways that do not yield simple lessons about dominance and submission. The fetish, which inhabits the border of the social and the psychological, throws into sharp relief the invalidity of separating the realms of psychoanalysis and social history. Both psychoanalysis and Marxism took shape around the idea of fetishism as a primitive regression and the disavowal of the social value of domestic work, so it is only fitting that the fetishistic proclivities of an obscure maid of all work should oblige us to begin, again, to renegotiate the relation between psychoanalysis and social history, women's agency and male power, domesticity and the market. What follows is less an attempt to empirically recover the past than it is an attempt to intervene strategically in historical narratives of race and fetishism, domesticity, and empire, in such a way as to throw into question not only the historical force of these relations in Victorian Britain but also their continuing implication for our time. No Pygmalion. Ambiguous agent. Munby and his biographer, Derek Hudson, both portray Colwick as little more than a cloddish, if charming, marionette, a curiosity trained, costumed and controlled by her massa, lumbering through her awkward theatrical paces to indulge his pleasures in later years. Munby claimed it was he who apprenticed Colwick to drudgery, training and teaching her in the lowest and most servile kind of work, initiating her into subservience and the indecorous degradations of their love registered when Colwick refused to enter society as his wife. Mumbai lamented that she had heeded his training too well and had become permanently wedded to drudgery. Colwick is likewise seen by Hudson as little more than the product of Mumbai's training of her in the ways of salvation through drudgery. Hudson finds, in consequence, that Colwick's diaries and letters need be sampled only briefly. Even Leonore Davidoff, in an otherwise excellent essay, presents a one-sided portrait of their relationship and sees Mumbai as the master of ceremonies of Colwick's life, the impresario and choreographer of their rituals, Svengali to her trilby. Hudson and Davidoff thereby both become complicit with Mumbai's self-congratulatory vision of himself as Pygmalion, sculpting Colwick's values as if from stone and instilling in her an overcommitment to drudgery. In many ways, Davidoff writes, Hannah was, in fact, a creature of his fancy, and as Davidoff sees it, their relationship was conducted on his terms and ultimately at a very high price. All this happens, she writes, at the will of the middle-class male protagonist who creates the situation and engineers the transformation. Once more, the maidservant vanishes from the middle-class narrative. Liz Stanley, however, in an excellent introduction to Colwick's diaries, protests these patronizing and dismissive portrayals of Colwick. To accept only Mumbai's account of matters and to see Colwick as no more than Mumbai's creation runs the very real risk of accepting Victorian sexist and classist thinking as an accurate reflection of the social world as it actually was. Rather, she argues, Mumbai's writings are frequently belied by the reality of experience. Certainly they are belied by Colwick's frequently contrasting perspectives. There is ample evidence in her diary, and in Mumbai's, if read against the grain, that Colwick invented as many of the scenarios and scripted as much of the game playing as Mumbai did. It was also clear that she received a good deal of pleasure and power from doing so, despite the unremitting disadvantage of her situation. Far from being a passive drudge, she was stubbornly and steadfastly protective of her own interests and fiercely resisted Mumbai when her needs came into conflict with his. The critical portrayal of Colwick as hapless jade and abused plaything serves only to annul the self-respect and agency she struggled so long and so stubbornly to achieve, under circumstances of extreme circumscription. Indeed, the erasure of Colwick's lifelong races tends to limitation presents a sad irony, for one might say that the project that animated her obscure and arduous life was the projet of the social reunition of women's domestic work. Certainly it was not Mumbai who initiated Colwick into the ambiguous value of pride in working-class labor, for her beloved mother and working-class community, the church, the charity SCLLOOL, the village, and the nearby manor had already shaped the foundations of her identity and her attitudes to work. To see Mumbai as the only and originary shaper of her identity is to capitulate in a dominant Victorian middle-class fantasy, the fantasy of male philanthropic surveillance and control over the lives of working-class women. At the same time, Colwick's relationship with Mumbai was inevitably informed by the discrepancy between her considerable power within the relationship and her social disempowerment outside it, a discrepancy that Mumbai was not at all averse to exploiting when he could. I do not wish, however, to give the impression that Colwick's relation to Mumbai was one of libertarian equality and mutual power. Such a notion is insupportable. Am interested, rather, in the more difficult question of what kind of agency is possible in situations of extreme social inequality. Colwick's life expressed a sustained determination to negotiate power within circumstances of great limitations, in ways that raise questions not about her cross-gender and cross-class relations with Mumbai, but also about her cross-class and intergender relations with her female employers. Within domestic households, the unequal burden of women's work, the mutual recriminations, class harassments, and class rebellions took place within a combination of class estrangements and gender intimacies. In short, a major theoretical concern of the CL Laughter wants to explore the strategic tension between social constraint and social agency. In what follows, I wish to question one feminist tendency to see women as unambiguous victims, a tendency that equates agency with context, body with situation, and thus annuls possibilities for strategic refusal. In this view, Colwick is reduced to a victimized drudge, exhibited as the embodiment of female degradation and male dominance. If she was not an unambiguous victim, however, she was also not an unambiguous heroine of female revolt. Her circumstances were unremittingly harsh and disadvantageous, yet within their conscription she engaged in a lifelong negotiation of power, throwing continually into question the binary verities of dominance and resistance, victim and oppressor. What, then, of Colwick's agency and desires in these curious rituals? Hannah Colwick's childhood was the commonplace story of a girl destined for a lifetime of service in Britain's ruling households. Daughter of a lady's maid and a saddler, she was born on May 26, 1833, in the Shropshire village of Shiphill. Her mother, Martha Colwick, worked for the Lady of the Hall, and her father worked as a stableman. Her parents thus served the vanishing world of the ancient gentry, where power was invested in land, and the landless classes related to the manorial class through ancestral codes of duty, philo and paternism. Although Colwick died in the village of her birth on July 9, 1909, she spent her life as a lower servant moving between the rural manorial estates and the urban houses of the manufacturing elite in London and Margate. In the imperial dockyards, merchant banks, factories, and mills, power was invested in capital and the far-flung losings of empire, and the working class related to the new masters through the unreliable dynamics of the cash nexus. Colwick's life thus straddled the dwindling world of the gentry and the ascendant world of industrial manufacture, and, if her childhood was in almost every respect ordinary, her life would crisscross some of the deepest fault lines of the Victorian age. Born in a rustic cottage in Shropshire, Colwick spent most of her life in the belching cities, working as a pot girl in an inn, as a nursery maid, a kitchen maid, a scullion, and drudge, and a rural stranger in the huge, begrimed houses of the Victorian urban elite. In the heyday of the idle woman, she grew muscular with manual labor. Destined by class to wed a laboring man, she married instead a member of the upper middle class bureaucracy. As a barrister's wife, Colwick could have entered Soclity, but chose instead to live as a maidservant among her own class, spending very little time under the same roof as her beloved husband. In an age when wifely services were void of economic value, she insisted that her husband pay her monthly wages. At a time when most women devoted 2/3 of their lives to raising children, she remained childless. When most women of the age were illiterate, she could read and write and left behind 17 diaries, which render in intimate detail the Herculean feats of her domestic toil. Her life was nondescript and her death caused no stir, but in retrospect her diaries offer a rare and important testimony to the life of a Victorian servant. Colwick's diaries bear invaluable witness to the last generation of women that did heavy manual labor in large numbers. In 1851 Colwick travelled with her employers to London, the rhythms of her life following the class logic of their seasonal migrations. In London a prescient vision in the fire showed her Mumbai face. In 1854, she returned to London, where Mumbai approached her in the street. When she returned again the following year, she found lodgings in a cold, tiny room. There Master came to see me again, and there was where I first blacked my face with oil and lead. At Colwick's instigation, the couple began their lifelong career in domestic and racial fetishism, and soon after, Colwick began to write the first of her 17 diaries. Nothing to use but your chains. S/M and domestic power. Colwick and Mumbai filled their lives with the theatrical paraphernalia of S/M, boots, chains, padlocks, leather, blindfolds, straps, costumes, scripts and photographs, some of them semi-pornographic. Their games included a variety of fetish rituals, transvestism, bondage, foot and leather fetishism, hand fetishism, washing rituals, infantilism, animalism and voyeurism. The primary transformations about which their fantasy games revolved were the central transformations of industrial imperialism, class, servant to mistress, race, white woman to black slave, gender, woman to man, economy, land to city, and age, adult to baby, transformations that were drawn simultaneously from the cult of domesticity and the cult of empire. As Liz Stanley notes, chains, bootlicking, and blacking up the better to show the abasement of a slave to a master aren't just images of servitude one in a conventional and often religious sense, they are also images replete with sadomasochistic and sexual overtones. Yet Stanley quickly rejects the usefulness or appropriateness of labeling their relationship as sadomasochistic. Registered for, she argues, while people in S/M scenarios may change roles, we see at any one time whoever is the master has power and whoever is the slave has not. Since Colwick was neither powerless nor slavish in this conventional sense, but was rather strong, stubborn, independent, assured, and competent. The term sadomasochism, Stanley contends, has no usefulness for understanding Colwick and Mumbai's power games. Stanley also rejects S/M as no more than the retrospective imposition on the past of images and terminology from the present. Yet it is no accident that the historical subculture of S/M emerged in Europe toward the end of the 18th century with the emergence of imperialism in its modern industrial form. As Foucault points out, S/M, which is not simply synonymous with cruelty or brutality, is a highly organized, ritual subculture that appeared precisely at the end of the 18th century, a few decades before Colwick and Mumbai were born. Late Victorian racial scientists demonized S/M as the psychopathology of the atavistic individual, a blood flaw and stigma of the flesh. The sciences of man philosophy, Marxism, anthropology, psychoanalysis sought to contain the eruptive implication of fetishism by projecting it onto the invented zone of degeneration, figuring it as a regression in historical time to the prehistory of racial degradation, the degeneration of the race writ in the pathology of the soul. S/M, however, is less a biological flaw, or a pathological expression of natural male aggression and natural female passivity, than it was an organized subculture shaped around the ritual exercise of social risk and social transformation. As a theater of conversion, S/M reverses and transforms the social meanings it borrows. To argue that in S/M whoever is the master has power and whoever is the slave has not, is to read theater for reality, it is to play the world forward. The economy of S/M, however, is the economy of conversion. Master to slave, adult to baby, power to submission, man to woman, pain to pleasure, human to animal and back again. S/M, as Foucault puts it, constitutes one of the greatest conversions of Western imagination, unreason transformed into delirium of the heart. S/M is a theater of transformation, it plays the world backward. Consensual S/M, the collective organization of fetishism, insists on exhibiting the primitive, slave, baby, woman, as a character in the historical time of modernity. S/M performs the primitive irrational as a dramatic script, a theatrical, communal performance in the heart of Western reason. The paraphernalia of S/M, boots, whips, chains, uniforms, is the paraphernalia of state power, public punishment converted to private pleasure. S/M plays social power backward, visibly and outrageously staging hierarchy, difference and power, the irrational, ecstasy, or alienation of the body, placing these ideas at the center of Western reason. S/M thus reveals the imperial logic of individualism and refuses it as fate, even though it does not finally step outside the enchantment of its own magic circle. Hence the paradox of S/M. On one hand, S/M parades a slavish obedience to conventions of power. In its reverence to formal ritual, it is the most ceremonial and decorous of practices. S/M is high theater, beautifully suited to symbolism. As theater, S/M borrows its decor, props, and costumery, bonds, chains, ropes, blindfolds, and its scenes, bedrooms, kitchens, dungeons, convents, prisons, empire, from the everyday cultures of power. At the same time, with its exaggerated emphasis on costumery, script and scene, S/M reveals that social order is unnatural, scripted, and invented. For Victorian science, nature was the overlord and guarantor of power. Thus for craft heaping, S/M enacts the male's natural sexual aggression and the female's natural sexual passivity. This sadistic force is developed by the natural shyness and modesty of women toward the aggressive manner of the male. The final victory of man affords her intense and refined gratification. The outrage of S/M, however, is precisely its hostility to the idea of nature as the custodian of social power. With the utmost artifice and levity, S/M refuses to read power as fate or nature and outrageously reverses the sacramental edicts of power and abandonment. Since S/M is the theatrical exercise of social contradiction, it is self-consciously anti-nature, not in the sense that it violates natural law, but in the sense that it denies the existence of natural law in the first place. S/M presents social power as sanctioned, neither by nature, fate, nor God, but by artifice and convention, and thus is radically open to historical change. S/M floods social order with its provocative confession that the edicts of power are reversible. As such, it is a radically historical phenomenon. S/M and the cult of domesticity. Colwick's lifelong power over Mumbai lay in her theatrical talent for conversion and her power to play the world backward, to switch from maid to mistress, wife to slave, nurse to mother, white woman to black man. She was the dreamed of combination, the blessed anomaly that allowed Mumbai to stage in his own private theater of transformation the fateful early contrasts of gender and class that both perplexed and enthralled him. Mumbai records his first sighting of her in his diary. A country girl, she was, a scullion. A tall erect creature, with light firm step and noble bearing, her face had the features and expression of a high-born lady, though the complexion was rosy and rustic, and the blue eyes innocent and childlike. Her bare arms and hands were large and strong and ruddy from the shoulder to the fingertips, but they were beautifully formed. A robust hard-working peasant lass, with the marks of labor and servitude upon her everywhere, yet endowed with a grace and beauty, an obvious intelligence, that would have become a lady of the highest. Such a combination I had dreamt of and sought for, but I have never seen it, save in her. For Mumbai, Colwick was a paragon of ambiguity, a country girl who trod the urban streets, a scullion formed like a high-born lady. She bore the marks of labor, but with aristocratic grace. She was both innocent and worldly wise. She was a child, but as strong as a man. By playing both drudge and lady, woman, and man, Colwick offered Mumbai the delirious promise of embodying in one person the contrast of mother and nurse, woman, and man, that so excited him. Let me, he wrote, at least work out some of my theories upon this tender servant, let me be refreshed and comforted by a mother's love and by that of one so different. Colwick's abiding attraction for Mumbai was her talent to play either part so well. He recalls her sitting after a day's drudgery dainty in black silk and drawing room cap, for is she not a servant during the day and a lady in the evening? And fulfills either part so well, that for some time she seems incapable of the other? Percent one moment she wants the very pattern of a kitchen drudge, awkward and strong, hard at work in sweat and dirt. In the next instant, she transforms herself into the perfect image of the still and stately Queen Fig 3.13, 3.14. Colwick offered Mumbai the illusion of control over the contradictions that shaped his identity. He relished her muscular brawn and her manliness, that allowed him to feel, by contrast, deliciously female, yet in such a way as not to endanger his precarious, compulsory manhood. And by indulging the fantasy that he was master of their ceremonies, Mumbai indulged in what John Berger has called the Pygmalion promise, the infantile desire to shape another being's life according to the dictates of one's own desires. But since Mumbai's mastery over Colwick was no more than her theatrical gift to him, which she had the power to withdraw at any time, and did, and since the contradictions that vexed him were social contradictions that could not be resolved at a personal level, the fetish scene was destined to recur again and again. S/M is a theater of signs. Mumbai was helplessly fascinated by the visible and written signs of Colwick's domesticity. The representation of domesticity as social and imperial allegory held him in its thrall. Obsessed with writing, Mumbai demanded that when Colwick could not appear physically in the sign of her dirt, she sent him verbal signs instead in the form of her diary. And Colwick, in turn, learned quickly to use her diary and her theatrical performances to manipulate Mumbai's desires and maintain control over him. Indeed, it was not so much the actuality of female labor that captivated Mumbai but the representation of labor, labor as spectacle, as photograph, as language, as diary, as sketch, as script, as theatrical scene. He and Colwick played their fetish games around the theatrical paraphernalia of domesticity, brooms, pails, water, soap, dirt fetishes that cannot, in my opinion, be usefully reduced to a single-minded phallic logic. In their theater of conversion, mundane household objects became invested with profound fetish power, as ambivalent signs of domestic subordination and domestic power. Why the stress on signs? As a theater of signs, S/M grants temporary control over social risk. By scripting and controlling the frame of representation, in other words, the control frame, the deity, the camera, the theatrical scene, the player, stages the delirious loss of control within a situation of extreme control. For Mumbai, loss of control and confusion of social boundary were mediated by an excessive preoccupation with control. He depended deeply on control frames, by which he managed the staging of social risk. Managing the control frame, the photograph, the sketch, the diary, the script, the circus and, in particular, the exchange of money was indispensable to his sense of mastery over what were otherwise terrifying ambiguities. S/M is haunted by memory. By reinventing the memory of trauma and staging loss of control in what is really a situation of excessive control, the player gains symbolic power over perilous memory. S/M affords a delirious triumph over memory and, from this triumph, an orgasmic excess of pleasure. But since the triumph over memory once theatrical and symbolic, however intensely felt in the flesh, resolution is perpetually deferred. For this reason, the memory, the scene, will recur for perpetual reenactment, and compulsive repetition emerges as a fundamental structuring principle of S/M. One tendency within feminism has been to demonize heterosexual S/M as the sanctioned exercise of male dominance over women. Sadomasochism is self-debasement on all levels that renders women unable to execute truly feminist goals. But, more often than not, S/M culture often reveals the opposite. In the world of the sadomasochist, there is nothing abnormal about a male being passive and submissive. Indeed, male passivity is by far the most common phenomenon. It is therefore not surprising that Mumbai was what is, in current parlance, called a babyist, or infantilist, relishing, as he did, to be bathed by Colwick, lifted in her massive arms and rocked and nursed on her ample lap like a baby. Registered perhaps in these encounters, Mumbai could surrender deliriously to the memory of his helplessness in his first nurse's arms, to voyeuristic pleasure at the spectacle of a working woman tending his passive body and to forbidden recognition of the social power of working-class women. The contradiction that Mumbai faced was his dependence on working-class women whom society stigmatized as subservient. By ritually recognizing Colwick, like his nurse, as socially powerful, he could acknowledge his forbidden childhood identification with powerful femininity. Particular. Why working-class femininity? His foot-washing fetish was an expiation ritual that symbolically absolved him from guilt and dirt while simultaneously letting him indulge in the forbidden, voyeuristic spectacle of women's work and women's power. Nonetheless, the recognition of domestic work as valuable was socially taboo and had to be mediated and controlled through carefully prearranged scripts. On one occasion, for example, Colwick asked Mumbai to visit her at her workplace. Once there, he was plunged into agitation and extreme distress. But to see her stand in a drawing room in her servant's dress and know that she is a servant and that the piano, the books, the pictures belong to her mistress, this I could not endure. Seeing Colwick in her workplace forced Mumbai into the agonized recognition that he did not really control, or own, her life. On another occasion he was appalled to visit her workplace and see how truly filthy and exhausted she was. What bothered him to distraction on both occasions was the collapse of his control frame and thus loss of his illusion of mastery over the scene. Seeing Colwick at work was a forcible reminder that another woman paid her wages, another woman gave her orders. Just as he was thrown into outrage at the sight of another journalist photographing his pit brow women, the sight of Colwick at work robbed Mumbai of his illusion that he controlled the dangerous scenario, and he was flung violently into crisis. Role switching is a common feature of S/M, and in their secret society of the spectacle, Colwick and Mumbai often switched roles. Most S/M is less the desire to inflict pain, as Freud argued, than it is the theatrical organization of social risk. Contrary to popular perceptions, a great deal of S/M involves no pain at all. Its ritual violations are less violations to the flesh than symbolic reenactments of the memory of violations to selfhood, violations that can take myriad forms. As Weinberg and Campbell argue, S&M scenarios are willingly and cooperatively produced. More often than not, it is the masochist fantasies that are acted out. Many S/M fetishists claim that in fact it is the bottom who is in control. Havelock Ellis points out that much S/M is motivated by love. Far from being the tyrannical exercise of one will upon a helpless other, S/M is more typically collaborative, involving careful initiation rituals, a scrupulous definition of limits, and a constant confirmation of reciprocity that can bind the players in an ecstasy of interdependence, abandonment at the very moment of dependence. But because S/M involves the negotiation of perilous boundaries, any violation of the script is fraught with risk, whereas mutual fidelity to the pledge of trust creates an intimacy of a very intense kind. If at any point control is lost, or the rules of the game transgressed, either of the players can be plunged into panic. Hence the importance and prevalence of scripting in consensual S/M. The slave band. Refusing objection. For years Colwick wore a filthy leather slave band on her wrist and a chain and lock padlock around her neck. Her original reason for wearing a strap, she tells us, was to support her wrist after a bad sprain. Later she wore it as a sign of her love for and servitude to Mumbai. When she insisted on wearing the strap while serving dinner, letting it show on her wrist before the invited company, her employer ordered her to remove it. Colwick declined to obey and was furiously dismissed, preferring, as she proudly records in her diary, to lose her employment rather than take off the sign that I'm a drudge and belong to Massa. Registered. What are we to make of Colwick's slave band, belonging as it does in the zone of the fetish? The fetish embodies a crisis in social meaning. In Colwick's slave band, three of the formative contradictions of the Victorian era converge, between slave labor and wage labor, between the private realm of domesticity and the public realm of the market, and between metropolis and empire. In the fetish of the slave band, race, class and gender overlap and contradict each other. The slave band, like most fetishes, is overdetermined. Colwick's transgression was to wear at dinner, the theater of middle-class consumption and female leisure, the forbidden sign of women's work. Colwick brought scandalously into crisis the incommensurable relation between the Victorian doctrine that women should not work for profit and the visible sign of female domestic labor, the faint, illicit odor of the kitchen, the stain of dirty water, the mark of labor in imperial leather. Colwick outraged convention by exhibiting, of her own stubborn volition, the public evidence of women's domestic dirt, banished by Victorian decree to kitchen and back corridor, cellar and garret, the architecture of the unseen. In refusing to take off her band, Colwick was refusing the social abjection of her labor and domestic dirt. Fig 3.15. For Colwick, the fetish of the slave band was specific to the recognition of social value. The idea of concealed labor is fundamental to the Marxist analysis of the commodity fetish. The idea of traumatic fixation upon an intense experience is fundamental to the psychoanalytic notion of the sexual fetish. Both ideas fuse in the slave band. In an important observation, William Peets notes that fetishism often arises from a crisis that brings together and fixes into a singularly resonant, unified intensity and unrepeatable event, permanent in memory, a particular object and a localized space. Paradoxically, this crisis moment, because of its degradation from any recognizable value code, becomes a moment of infinite value. The death of Colwick's mother was just such an unrepeatable moment. The localized space was the architectural space of upper-class domesticity, and the particular object was the imperial fetish of the slave band. Here the crisis does involve the mother's body, but not in the way that Freud envisaged. As a child of 14, working away from home as a nursemaid, Colwick was called without warning from the family schoolroom and was summarily told that both her parents had died of illness a few weeks before. Abandoned to cry alone on the floor where she had fallen and refused leave to return home to help her orphaned brothers and sisters, Colwick felt that the death of her beloved mother stripped her life of all value. It seemed as if my care for life or work was all gone. The crisis took on fetish form, for the violence of the chance encounter with death and her employer's refusal to let her mourn marked a radical break with history and community, costing her not only her family but also the symbolic value of her work and her sense of control over her own life. The death of her mother flung her into intense collision with the power of the upper-class family to subjugate her value to their needs. I don't think I ever shall get over it. I shall never play again or bowl hoops around the garden. Henceforth, her mother would be represented by the striving of a memory, trying to dream of her ghost. With the slave band, Colwick turned memory into a repeatable object. In photograph after photograph, she posed in such a way as to display her slave band to maximum effect. Like all fetishes, the slave band was contradictory, embodying the power of the upper class to enslave her, while at the same time exhibiting her determination to reclaim the value of her work and the memory of her mother. At the marked side of her wrist, damaged by the trauma of labor, she transformed bondage into the secret sign of self-assertion. By deliberately letting the filthy band show at dinner, she reclaimed her independence and her right to contract her labor as she pleased. By flouncing out of her employment, she claimed her right to control her own body and her own work. By contracting herself to Mumbai's his symbolic slave, she took control, in the symbolic realm, of lack of control in the social realm. Her adamant and entirely unsubservient refusal to take off the band revealed, moreover, that she valued it only as a symbol of power over which she had ultimate control. Most importantly, by displaying her wrist filthy with labor, she rejected the stigma of shame attached to domestic work. If the Victorian cult of domesticity voided her work of social recognition, she stubbornly displayed her hands in public to exhibit their economic value. My hands and arms are though chief to me, to get my living with. Hashtag. Colwick's fetishistic attachment to her slave band expressed, I suggest, a lifelong attempt to reinvent the memory of her mother's domestic value in the eyes of the upper class. The upper class undervaluation of her work found its antithesis in her overvaluation of her work. Her slave band and her profound commitment to domestic labor embodied a compulsive determination to maintain control, at whatever physical cost, of the realm of labor in which she was subordinated. The cross-cultural experience is marked by the fetish views in the slave band, in the triangular relations among slavery as the basis of mercantile capitalism, wage labor as the basis of industrial capitalism, and domestic labor as the basis of patriarchy. By flagrantly wearing on her body the fetish leather of bonded labor, Colwick threw into question the liberal separation of private and public, insisting on exhibiting her work, her dirt, her value in the home, that space putatively beyond both slave labor and wage labor. Exhibiting her filth as value, she gave the lie to the disavowal of women's work and the rational, middle-class control of dirt and disorder. The dirt fetish. Colwick's employer's principal objection to her band was its dirt. Colwick and Munbay's rituals, the foot and boot cleaning, the washing rituals, Munbay's voyeuristic desire to see Colwick in her dirt, Colwick's deliberate blacking, the photographs, the slave band were organized and complex but repetitive ways around the Victorian dirt fetish. Fix 3.16 to 3.18. Why did dirt exert such a compulsive fascination over their imaginations, as it did over the Victorian era at large? Nothing one's inherent. Why dirty? Dirt expresses a relation to social value and social disorder. Dirt, as Mary Douglas suggests, is that which transgresses social boundary. Asterisk, a broom in a kitchen closet is not dirty, whereas lying on a bed it is. Sex with one's spouse is not dirty, whereas conventionally the same act with a prostitute is. In Victorian culture, the iconography of dirt became deeply integrated in the policing and transgression of social boundaries. Dirt is what is left over after exchange value has been extracted. In Victorian culture, the bodily relation to dirt expressed a social relation to labor. The male middle class seeking to dismantle the aristocratic body and the aristocratic regime of legitimacy came to distinguish itself as a class in two ways. It earned its living, unlike the aristocracy, and it owned property, unlike the working class. Unlike the working class, however, its members, especially its female members, could not bear on their bodies the visible evidence of manual labor. Dirt was a Victorian scandal because it was the surplus evidence of manual work, the visible residue that stubbornly remained after the process of industrial rationality had done its work. Dirt is the counterpart of the commodity. Something is dirty precisely because one's void of commercial value, or because it transgresses the normal commercial market. Dirt one's by definition useless, because it is that which belongs outside the commodity market. If, as Marx noted, commodity fetishism flamboyantly exhibits the overvaluation of commercial exchange as the fundamental principle of social community, then the Victorian obsession with dirt marks a dialectic, the fetishized undervaluation of human labor. Smeared on trousers, faces, hands and aprons, dirt was the memory trace of working class and female labor, uncml_y evidence that the fundamental perpetuation of industrial and imperial wealth lay in the hands and bodies of the working class, women, and the colonized. Dirt, like all fetishes, thus expresses a crisis in value, for it contradicts the liberal dictum that social wealth is created by the abstract, rational principles of the market and not by labor. For this reason, Victorian dirt entered the symbolic realm of fetishism with great force. As the 19th century drew on, the iconography of dirt became a poetics of surveillance, deployed increasingly to police the boundaries between normal sexuality and dirty sexuality, normal work and normal money and dirty money. Dirty sex, masturbation, prostitution, lesbian, and gay sexuality, the host of Victorian perversions transgressed the libidinal economy of male-controlled, heterosexual reproduction within monogamous marital relations, clean sex that has value. Likewise, dirty money associated with prostitutes, Jews, gamblers, thieves transgressed the fiscal economy of the male-dominated, market exchange, clean money that has value. Like prostitutes and female minors, servants stood on the dangerous threshold of normal work, normal money, and normal sexuality, and came to be figured increasingly in the iconography of pollution, disorder, plagues, moral contagion and racial degeneration. Here a crucial aspect of Victorian imperialism emerges. The relation between the normal economy of heterosexual marriage and the normal economy of capital exchange was legitimized and made natural by reference to a third term, the invention of the abnormal zone of the primitive and the irrational. Money, work, and sexuality were seen to relate to each other by negative analogy to the realm of racial difference and empire. Thus, historical contradictions internal to imperial liberalism, the distinctions between private and public, paid work and unpaid work, the formation of the male, propertied individual, and the denial that slaves, women and the colonized were possessive individuals, between the ratio NAL and the irrational, were contained by displacement onto a third term, the term of race. Class and gender distinctions were displaced and represented as natural racial differences across time and space, the difference between the enlightened present and the primitive past. Colwick's slave band embodies the traces of both personal and historical memory, her own subjugated labor and the slave labor on which industrial capital was built. By the second half of the 17th century, black people brought to Britain by slavers, merchants, and plantation owners lived scattered all over England, though they clustered mostly in London. By the turn of the 18th century, London and Bristol were thriving slave ports, continuing for another 100 years to garner huge profits from the murderous transport and sale of human beings. In Britain, the possession of a black slave became an emblem of new imperial wealth, and advertisements raising a hue and cry after escaped slaves show that they were customarily obliged to wear metal collars riveted round their necks. Made of brass, copper, or silver, the collar was generally inscribed with the owner's name, initials, coat of arms, or other symbol. Asterisk, at the Lord Mayor's pageant, the annual festival of London's merchant capitalists, black people were obliged to perform in opulent costumes and these fetish collars, exhibiting in public displays of sumptuary excess the wealth of the imperial metropolis and the forced labor on which mercantile capitalism was built. The slave collar here embodies a contradiction between the extravagant display of black slaves for their exhibition value and the total denial of the value of their lives and work. Colwick's slave collar, as a fetish, thus embodied a double disavowal, the historical erasure both of slave labor and of working-class women's labor as the foundation of modern industrial power. The slave band and chain collar brought into the bourgeois home the memory of empire chains, straps and bondage at the precise moment when the industrial economy was being transformed from a slave market to a wage market. The fetish slave band thus stages the history of industrial capital as haunted by the traumatic and ineradicable memory of imperial slavery. S/M and rituals of recognition. S/M performs the failure of the Enlightenment idea of individual autonomy, theatrically staging the dynamics of interdependency for personal pleasure. But S/M is not merely an existential, timeless Hegelian drama of self and other, being and nothingness. Rather, it is a historical subculture that draws its symbolic logic from changing social contradictions. What is the social logic of Colwick's pleasure in domestic S/M? The desire for submission, writes Campbell, represents a peculiar transposition of the desire for recognition. Registered if Colwick gave Mumbai license to negotiate the contradictions of class and gender, Mumbai gave Colwick the longed-for ritual recognition of the value of her labor. When Colwick was a girl, her identity came into being through paradox. Through an obscure economy of social affirmation by self negation and the edicts of class abasement, she learned very early that she would be rewarded only if she denied herself. Performing sanctioned and scripted rituals of obeisance, curtsying, and bowing before the gentry, she won affirmation only through negation of self. The need for recognition by the upper class entered her identity with the force of an ineradicable contradiction. Colwick inherited a perilous paradox. Her primary source of self-esteem was recognition as a worker. This meant being obedient, sturdy, independent and economically resourceful but, according to Victorian decree, only if she remained invisible. Domestic work shaped the deepest formation of her self-esteem and the boundaries between herself and others, particularly women, registered, yet her extraordinary feats of domestic labor were publicly and ritually despised as filthy work without social value. Her beloved, laboring mother, the first to bestow recognition and limits to selfhood, was socially despised as menial and inferior, a vassal to shame. Colwick knew only too well how dependent the women of the upper class were on her labor. Miss M was fussy and whining-like, and yet so small and feeble. It seemed hard to be provoked so by her, and for me to be patient and meek to one as I could crush with one hand almost, and I so much taller nor her, and I pitied her too. Yet these helpless women constantly denied her the magical ingredient of social recognition. Colwick spent much of her energy performing what can be called rituals of recognition for the upper classes. Bobbing and curtsying, demurely taking a man's hat, theatrically lowering her eyes and voice, leaving a room backward, kneeling to remove the master's shoes, being stepped over by upper-class women. These were ritual performances in which Colwick ceremonially recognized those who paid her to do so. Her ritualized presence was thus a necessary element in her employer's class identity. Yet, by contrast, social recognition of her strength was perpetually deferred. I somehow never got much praise in service, she remarked sadly. One can call the project that animated her life the project of recognition, at the very moment when female manual labor was being erased from view. Colwick repeatedly insists that she likes work and likes being working class, for freedom and true lowliness. There's nothing like being a maid of all work. Her diary contains frequent entries such as the following: the summer went on and I worked away and enjoyed it. I'll get the life I lead working here and just going to what I can of a Sunday. She also prefers physical work, which taxes her immense strength and gives her a sense of accomplishment, so I often cleaned the steps for her and shook the doormats in the square, and one really liked it better than making the rolls. Work, especially visible work, was an exhibition of strength, and her capacity to pull off astonishing feats of labor affords her much pleasure. She is inordinately proud of her muscular prowess and enjoys lifting Mumbai and other men to show off her strength. I can heave my master easy and carry him as if he was a child merely. I lifted him easily and carried him, and then he lifted me and said I was hairy when I am 11 stone. Registered, she habitually measured her body to prove her value, an ironic mimicry of the Victorian discourse of degeneration and the fetish for measurement. My arm is 13 3/4 inches round the muscle, she writes proudly, and my hand 4.5 inches across the inside. Asterisk, on more than one occasion, however, the murderous workload became too much even for her, got up and come down to the wretched-looking kitchen, and I felt so sick and bad from so much dirt and hard work. Colwick was stung to miserable indignation when her employers refused to recognize her Amazonian feats. I did all I could to show that I liked dirty, hard work, but Mrs. Bishop never seemed satisfied, and wasn't either. Registered, when Miss Margaret come down to give orders, she began about the work and said she was surprised that everything wasn't more thoroughly done. I said, well, ma'am, whether you know it or no, I've worked very hard. A fortnight's nothing to clean a big house like this in. I'd worked harder in the time nor ever I would again for anybody. She said no more, but left me feeling quite sick with disappointment. Registered, for Colwick, class recognition seemed to matter more than gender recognition, throwing into question some feminist theories that men alone are privileged owners of the gaze. Apart from Mumbai, she seldom mentions her male employers. On the rare occasions when upper-class women acknowledge her prowess, she radiates special pride. She said, what arm you've got? I said, why yes, ma'am, I'm pretty strong, and it does me good to fetch the beer in the bracing wind. I came away with my beer feeling quite pleased at being noticed, and my arms did look big and red, and I reckon I weighed 11 stone 7 and a 1/2. Power through being the spectacle of another's gaze is an ambiguous power. It allows one to internalize the gaze of the voyeur and participate in the vicarious enjoyment of their power. Yet it also breeds a corresponding dependency on the one endowed with the social privilege of approval. Feminists have offered sophisticated analyses of the male prerogative of gazing, yet here there is much evidence that upper-class women held that privilege in Colwick's life. She recalls cleaning the grates, while the Mrs. Knights watched voyeuristically. The one in bed called me, and she poured water onto my black hand to wet the grate with it, and so she wasn't disgusted. The pouring of water effected a baptismal cleansing and exoneration of class debasement. She wasn't disgusted, granting Colwick one of her treasured moments of recognition. Miss Julia used to like to see me clean and after sweep. She said she thought it very interesting to see me clean the paint so thoroughly. Her longing for class recognition is assuaged. At the same time, recording such moments in her diary renews her power over Mumbai. In the private theater of domestic S/M, Mumbai bestowed on Colwick, repeatedly and ritualistically, the rare, dreamed of recognition of her work, for he was and always as interested in my work. Mumbai figured as the official witness of her concealed domestic value. I wrote and told him about it all. Registered, at such moments, however, a curious metamorphosis transpires. Reading the diary later, Mumbai is put in an oddly female role, occupying the same position of voyeur of the forbidden spectacle of Colwick's work as her female employers, precisely that female association which so enflamed and enchanted him. In her fetish rituals with Mumbai, Colwick reinvented the scene but converted the terms, playing the drudge for value. Ostentatiously blacking her face, rubbing grating polish deeply into her hands, taking herself to be photographed, as she did, in her dirt, Colwick converted the scene of disavowal into the scene of theatrical display. Ambiguities of dependence. One cannot exaggerate the influence of Christianity on Colwick's fetish life. Christianity offered Colwick the promise of deferred recognition. Gad saw her work, God recognized her value. By lowering herself in drudgery, she exalted herself in the eyes of the master. By working, she accrued 64. Spiritual capital, storing up a surplus stock of value in heaven. The economy of Christianity is the economy of conversion, the low exalted, the high made low. Like Christianity, S/M performs the paradox of redemptive suffering, and like Christianity, it takes shape around the masochistic logic of transcendence through the mortification of the flesh. Through self-abasement, the spirit finds release in an ecstasy of abandonment. S/M shares with Christianity a theatrical iconography of punishment and expiation, washing rituals, bondage, flagellation, body piercing, and symbolic torture. In both S/M and Christianity, earthly desire exacts strict payment in an economy of penance and pleasure. The couple's washing rituals, I suggest, allowed Mumbai to indulge his hand fetishism, watching Kolwick's blackened male hand stroke, rub, and massage his male extremities. These were purification rituals, an exoneration of guilt and transgression. For Kolwick, these washing rituals were a staged appropriation of Christian pageantry, offering her a delirious advance on her spiritual credit, a stolen taste of what should properly be her exaltation in the hereafter. For both, these fetish rituals express a negotiation of power for pleasure far more complex than can be captured in easy binaries of victims and oppressors. For Kolwick, her theatrical displays of submission were a way of negotiating power over Mumbai as well as a means of gaining ritual control over her own very real social disempowerment. She clearly saw her enslavement as ceremonial rather than real, a symbolic gift to Mumbai that she could retract at any moment. Her diaries show her determined to be mistress of her theater of submission, and she reacted with unmitigated fury when Mumbai had the temerity to intimate that she really was his slave or presumed to treat her as if she really was a drudge. Indeed, Kolwick fiercely defended her right to be mistress of all her theatrical displays of humility, even with other employers. She brooked no injustice from employers, showing great temper when anyone dared suggest that they, rather than she, managed the scenes. Miss M said that she was the best judge of that, and I said, "No, ma'am, you can't tell me about my work so well as I can." Suppose she saw a little temper in me, the same as saw in her, for she said, "Hannah, you forget your place." I said, "No, ma'am, don't." Mumbai, too, earned her wrath if he presumed to play with her patience, then resentment like rises up inside me and pride, and will not let me speak nor be pleasant and nice as I want to be. Asterisk. Mumbai, nonetheless, liked to indulge the fantasy that he alone was master of their games, an unwarranted arrogance that became a lifelong source of conflict between them. He often tried to insist on complete control over Kolwick, as often, she resisted him. One such misunderstanding nearly brought their relationship to an end. Kolwick was in Mumbai's chambers working as his housekeeper and did not know a boy was on the stairs. So when Mumbai insisted on her calling him sir, and went upstairs to ring the bell for her, she exploded with rage at his violation of the rules and his unilateral changing of the script. I thought, well, that is showing off certainly, and I went upstairs with my temper up to its highest, and Mumbai began to question me about not saying sir to him, as the lad was on the stairs. So I was really in a passion. Mumbai had desecrated their secret rites, callously violating the boundaries between theater and reality and confusing Kolwick's ceremonial submission with real submission. The magic spell was broken and Kolwick furiously threatened him with an ultimatum. I declared that if M tantalized me in that way again, I would leave him whether we was married or not, for I didn't care a straw for that. The tragic paradox of Kolwick's life, however, was that Mumbai gave her the longed-for recognition of working-class value, but only in private. Choosing public recognition as his wife, as he wanted, meant denying her labor power, losing her social mobility and bartering her independence of spirit. Kolwick never escaped this social paradox. It could be negotiated but not individually resolved. In this way, S/M brings to its limit the liberal promise of social resolution through individual agency alone. In order to understand more fully the meaning of Kolwick's fetishism, it is necessary to explore the social context in which it found its meaning and against which it set itself as stubborn refusal. This context was the historical invention of the middle-class labor of leisure and the invisible servant.